We have with us tonight for our second presenter in class, Kelly Lindstrom, and Kelly's a kook. So that's always awesome when we can connect with
I
people
am
in
a
this
kid.
industry who are one of us. And so I appreciate her making the time. As she mentioned, she's in Central Time, so she's 2 hours ahead of us, and it's even later for her. Kelly is the COO of Vitality Living, a company that's headquartered in Tennessee. And in keeping with our financial management module this week, Kelly is going to talk about creating value creation in senior living. I will turn it over to her and let her introduce herself a little bit further. And the floor is yours, Kelly. Thank you.
Great. So as Nancy said, I'm Kelly. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. Our company's based out of Brentwood, which is just kind of south of downtown Nashville. Been here for a couple of years and started out in the industry with Emeritus. Actually worked with Granger Cobb. And my first job in the industry was answering a 1-800 complaint line for our company. And I talked to residents and families who were dissatisfied, and probably one of my most favorite jobs, believe it or not. I credit that job with really teaching me what the industry was all about. And I knew all of the executive directors. I spoke to residents, I spoke to families. I learned our policies and procedures. And I started to just understand uh, the industry first through the customer's eyes, but also through kind of the challenges of an executive director, how difficult it is living in your community plus all their family members. Training and development, really working on how to train and in customer service. And then as memory care started to develop in the company or in the industry, I really became interested in various leadership roles and eventually doing an executive leadership role around developing memory care programming and engagement programming. And then found my way into operations when I started with Vitality. First built out the engagement and Vivid Life program that we currently have, or at least the skeleton of it, and then took on the COO role about 3 years ago, right before COVID hit and the whole industry changed overnight. And been doing that for the last 3 years. And when I think of value creation, it's kind of like a day in the life of my job. I think I talk to every regional vice president of operations that reports to me about value creation. I was on an owner's call today talking about value creation. I talked to executive directors about it. We talked to the nurses, the salespeople. You know, in our world of Vitality, you know, we see value creation as something every leader, every team member contributes to and is responsible for ultimately, because it's really this idea of running the business well from both a revenue and expense side of things to deliver value within the business itself. And the investors and the owners in any, whether it's publicly traded or privately held like we are, you know, we are responsible to run the business effectively. And, you know, in our industry to do that, you have to provide good care. You have to care about residents. You have to care about team members. You know, there's just not that many successful companies that do this well from a profitability standpoint and sacrifice quality of care or quality of team member experience in doing that. So I'm excited to talk to you about it today and share a little bit about my experience as we go. And you guys cue me along if there's something I missed or you want to ask me. So first and foremost, you know, I'm sure you've heard as you've been talking about this industry, we've been talking about this silver tsunami for gosh, so many years. Now that I have silver hair, I feel like I'm a part of it. But really, this is looking at the demographics. You know, why is this industry remotely attractive to an investor, or why do people want to get into this industry? And if you just look at the demographics of how particularly the population in the United States is aging, you see that there is quite a few people who will become you know, more interested, have higher needs as it relates to their aging, both physical, cognitive, social, emotional needs. And that's driving kind of that consumer base, that there are people who need these services. So these demographics are very promising, and that's what a lot of investors will look at. That's what we look at when we think about what we want to do, how we want. And you're also looking at those demographics, building a building, investing in a building. So this starts to get more granular as operators or investors start to look at individual markets. One of the other main things that we know as people age is that your risk for cognitive impairment increases, whether that's age-related dementia through Alzheimer's disease or other Parkinson's disease or other kind of diseases that are typically associated with age. The leading cause of Alzheimer's disease is age. And so when we look at that cognitive impairment, we know that the ease of which it is to take care of someone living with dementia gets more difficult as that disease progresses. So that's just another kind of indicator that there's a consumer base there that's obviously going to be looking very specifically for memory care product and options. But some folks, as they think about possibly living with dementia, or if they have an early diagnosis, they may be looking at independent and assisted living as well. So it's more demographics that really kind of show this driver towards the senior living industry. And making it attractive from an investment standpoint. When you think about it, it's also real estate. Our communities are the buildings alone, the property alone is a real estate investment as well. And then the business within it, the services within it, right? But the real estate alone has quite a strong record of outperforming other sectors of real estate. And that's just really what this chart is looking at in terms of the returns on different types of real estate properties. So we compete right up there. And it's really looking at nursing care, senior housing, and then the 10-year treasuries in there as well. So nursing care is obviously looking at the more skilled nursing type of setting. And senior housing is that independent, active adult, assisted living, memory care product line, kind of everything up until that skilled nursing component comes in. And you see, again, it's very promising performance from an investment standpoint. So what is senior living? The one thing that kind of has been my experience, even after doing this for more years than I like to admit, because it says how old I am, people still think that assisted living and senior living is a nursing home. People ask me all the time, oh, isn't your job so depressing? Especially when I used to work in memory care. And I'm like, no, it's actually really fun. When you go into our communities, it's actually a lot of positive things are happening. I have more and more friends who are starting to shop and look at senior living, and they're telling me like, oh, it's so much nicer. It's better than the places I lived out of college, or it's nicer than what I expected. It's like a nice condo building. And that really is, a misperception, is that it is an institution, that it is highly medical, hospital, skilled nursing, like kind of all of those stereotypes that are often in movies and TV shows. But really, when you look at this slide, it kind of tells you what these different components and what makes this industry, from my perspective, really interesting and also challenging, is that there's these three different components. So obviously, there's this apartment kind of residential perspective of the business. Our landscape, our security, the utilities, just everything you would think about from an apartment building, we are also providing and having to service and pay for and manage. And then you have this hospitality component, which I think people understand. This is this concierge service. We do laundry. Oh, you'll see a little lightning show in the background there. Security, there might be a business office available for residents to use. There's dining, there's transportation, there's engagement, there's exercise programs. Sometimes there's very specific amenity spaces that you would look for in a hotel or a high-end apartment building is happening in a senior living environment as well. So there is this expectation of service from our residents and what we deliver that is very similar to that hospitality side of a business. And then there's physical plant components to that, and then there are services that go with that. And then there's the piece that people I think about first as you think about some sort of living situation as you age, which is this healthcare component. And in assisted living, we're unique, and I'm sure you've all learned, like, when it comes to healthcare. But in large part, we are assisting people with just being able to actually live fairly independent, some hands-on assistant with bathing, with ambulating, maybe with getting dressed, things that become more difficult if you have mobility issues. You don't want to slip or trip or fall in the bathroom, helping manage medication, because a lot of our seniors take up to 30 medications, which is a lot for any one person to manage. So this clinical component kind of ties all of those pieces together. But then it's also, we've got call light systems that we're required to have, so they can call for help if they need it when they're in their apartment, or they might have a wearable that they're calling for. We provide diet support. So if somebody is on a, no added salt, or no, they maybe minimize their sugar because they're diabetic. So there's different things we do that are more clinically based. But we aren't necessarily, we don't, some communities, some do, some don't, but you're not required to have an in-house doctor or a medical director. That's very much a skilled nursing kind of healthcare component. So there is kind of this line with which we're still doing this healthcare, but we're doing it in this really unique apartment environment with this hospitality twist. So the expectations are high to deliver on all three of those areas from a customer standpoint. But then from a business standpoint, you're also managing a lot of people, business practices, and expense management, but then also charging, right? So there's revenue streams that can be associated with these things as well. So what drives our rate? So this kind of gives you a sense of, how the costs or the rates that we charge for living in any of these elements of our business, kind of how they compare. So obviously nursing care or a skilled nursing environment is the most expensive because you are doing the most complex healthcare. That's a predominantly healthcare driven product. Luckily, I think a lot of the environments have improved and they're not as institutional as they used to be. But that's really why you see that big expense. They do have higher staffing ratios, more like RN kind of license. There's usually a licensed social worker, there's medical directors. So you're just carrying a higher expense load. So you're going to have a higher rate there. And the services you're providing are going to be much more aligned with, a more complex healthcare need. When you look at memory care, you're really supporting somebody who's living with dementia. So you're helping them orient to time and place. You're keeping them generally safe. You're minimizing risk. You're not ever getting rid of it completely, but you're also engaging them. So you're paying for an engagement program that's hopefully specially designed for them, and a higher staffing ratio. So we usually have a few more caregivers per resident, the way you break it down is you have more caregivers for the whole group because you're running a smaller staffing ratio. So that's going to increase your ability to charge a higher rate there. So you're going to see anywhere, can go north of $6,000 a month for someone living in memory care. And then assisted is usually without that cognitive support, right? So we're still doing the same type of physical support, but there's not necessarily that intensive need for the support around the memory loss or living with dementia. So that's going to be somewhere around $5,000 on average. And then finally, independent living. There's just no healthcare with independent living. It's not licensed. It is predominantly hospitality and apartment. So you're not doing that healthcare component. If you are, the residents are getting it themselves. You might have a preferred provider for private sitter or some sort of support that's happening. But it's going to be very unique to that resident, and they're the one paying for it. You're not providing it as the operator. That make sense? Okay. There is a storm starting, so if my kids come in, it's only because they're scared. So you guys will have to, it's like COVID times, and it's like school time with my kids. All right, so let's talk about how we make revenue. So as I said, there's these different, the business is complex because we have these different elements, but there's a revenue component to these different elements. So it starts with this apartment component. So first and foremost, your revenue is driven by your census. Have paying rent to higher your revenue. That is your big, and then your base rate. So that's kind of what you are charging for that apartment. And there's going to be differentials, just like anywhere you go to rent an apartment. A studio apartment's going to be cheaper than a one bedroom. 2 bedrooms going to be more expensive than the studio. It's all of those things. So we might have some differentials in that base rate based off of square footage, location, close to the elevator, first floor versus third floor, close to the exercise room. There's going to be some differences, and most operators will do some sort of price differential. We certainly do, particularly now. I think the business gets more savvy around how to create that base rate, and create some value prop there, whether you discount it because it's not desirable or you add some more dollars because it is highly desirable location. And you're looking at how you can play with that to, again, drive that revenue component up, whether you offer a lower base rate to get somebody in, or you drive up the rate and you're just getting more rate for that one move-in. And then there's community fees. So we typically have a move-in fee. Most operators are going to charge a move-in fee that kind of helps cover the administrative work for a resident to move in. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot that we do to prepare for a move-in, and that fee is expected pretty industry-wide. Sometimes it's waived as part of a concession, but it is something that most of our competitors, and we certainly are charging a community fee in most of our communities, anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000. You see some go up to $6,000 and $10,000 if it's a very high-end community. It really depends. From that hospitality business side of things, the revenue generation is, again, through census. So you have a high volume of components of the business. You have rate associated with that. And then you have ancillary fees. So a beauty salon could have an ancillary fee charged to it. We're starting to develop, and you'll see that in a lot of assisted living, there'll be some specialized dining components that might have a revenue component with it. So we have a cafe, or you have a grab and go deli, or you do a bar, or you do something where beyond just part of an engagement program, it's something that you're actually charging the residents for. We're also seeing some hospitality things with concierge type services, right? So we'll pick up your dry cleaning for you. We'll drive you to go shopping in a town car versus a big bus that says, hey, old people on the bus, whatever the case may be. So some operators develop some add-on charges that are ancillary fees that are tied to this idea of hospitality. And so in assisted living for us, we might have some additional, you might get 1 day of laundry a week. And then if you want anything else, it's an additional ancillary charge. So some of those services, just again, depending on the operator, sometimes it's regulatory, but not as much on the ancillary side. You'll see different kind of components of that hospitality business that you charge a rate for. I should say guest meals is also a really popular one. Families come to eat and they want to share a meal and they want to eat with us. There's usually a ancillary fee around guest meals. And then there's the clinical component or the wellness component. And this is probably, we've most recently, we've been in the process of doing some acquisitions. And this is one of those things where every operator does it a little bit different, but there's a large portion of revenue generated by charging for a fee in addition to that base rate, a level of care charge specific to what the residents' needs are. Most of our communities of Vitality, we do 4 levels of care. I have seen operators do 8 and 10 levels of care. It really depends. And that really starts with that nursing assessment to say, hey, what does this resident need? What does this individual need support with? Some people do it based off layers like a point system related to each one of those elements of the assessment. Some do it off minutes of care, how much labor time is going to be spent doing that. And they back into kind of what their levels of care and adjust for that. And they can also, and I've also seen it a la carte. So you can add services from a care perspective, almost like a hospitality model, if you wanted to get a shower every day, even if you didn't necessarily need that. So there's different ways to do it, but there's typically a separate or line item charge related to care. There's also a separate specific kind of generation of revenue through med management. And it's one of the most intensive things that we do. And you have to typically have a licensed person. So you have to have a nurse on staff that's going to oversee the med management component. If you have a med tech, they're licensed. So you have very specialized field team members or employees that are delivering that med management component. So there's fees generated with that. And then there's also ancillary charges. Most common as we do incontinence packages, so people don't have to go buy products that support their incontinence, that we usually can get a high quality product at a somewhat discounted rate. And then there's just the ease that we're the ones ordering it and managing it so there's an ease to the customer. So we do that. Recently, we've started working with a group called iWatch. I don't know if you all have talked about iWatch at all. I don't know if this has come up. It's a great, it's a fall detection through cameras in memory care that we're using. And it only flips on if there's kind of a movement within, they kind of set up these sensors in the room. And it calls for the staff to go see the resident. And it also through one of the platforms we're using, well, we use iWatch and Safely You. There's two, they do essentially the same thing. And they'll talk to the one can talk to the resident and say, stay there, you're going to be okay. They're coming to help you. But it's really helped us reduce sending residents out to the ER for an unwitnessed fall, which you often do in memory care. And we have done kind of a 90-day pilot, and now we're starting to charge families for it. There's just a high level of kind of peace of mind associated with it for that time when somebody who's living with dementia is alone in their room. We don't see everything that they do. And so when they are found on the ground, we just assume they fall. We tend to have to send them out, make sure that they don't have any sort of head injury. And it can be really difficult. This has allowed us to see like, no, they sat down on the floor on themselves, or they did fall, but they didn't hit their head, or we can actually get them to stop before they get out of bed and wait for some assistance. So that's been one of the, in this last year, an ancillary fee that we've started adding from a wellness perspective, very specific to memory care. And there's more of those types of technologies that are available that can have some fees associated with them. I know that there's some different providers doing different things with like the Alexas of the world that the residents can talk to and kind of get their daily schedule and some of those pieces. And there's fees associated with that. And so some of that kind of goes into that resident monitoring or wellness component of the business. So those are some of our core drivers around revenue. Then there's the flip side that every operator spends a lot of time focused on, which is the expense side of things. And really, as important as every move-in and delivering a great experience is for your residents so that you are making that revenue, you have to be really good stewards of those dollars. And that's often how I think of it, that it's important that we think about how we're spending our money, how we are leveraging this kind of investment, either investors making us, but also our residents who are paying us every month and trusting us, that we're doing right by those expectations. So there's in the apartment business, it's a lot of the physical plant stuff. I mean, just like owning a home or owning a property, you can imagine right now does anyone have any roof damage from the winds and the rains? Are we having any, we have power outage, we're on generator power. How is that going to impact our AC units? Like there are so many components to the physical plant. This has been one of my biggest learning curves because when I was just doing memory care programming, I wasn't too worried about whether or not the elevators went up and down every day. But when they go down, it's expensive, and it causes a lot of havoc. So there's a lot of expense management with just doing preventative maintenance, changing out filters so your AC doesn't break, keeping up on your elevator maintenance, all those components. And then there are, just as the buildings age, you do have to go in and fix equipment. You have to update, you have to get new carpet, and those things can get expensive very quickly. We have a building, actually a year ago, a week, was hit by a tornado up in Little Rock. We are still recovering, they're still rebuilding, and you can just imagine the dollars being spent, right? Because we lost a roof and we lost electricity, and there's just a lot of basically rebuilding a community. So that facility maintenance is huge. And then we have to do the sales and marketing. We have to have a digital marketing spend. We have to have advertising spend. We have to pay for collateral. So there's just a lot that goes into the sales and marketing component of the business as well. And that's very similar to the apartment business. On the hospitality side, really it's the labor costs. How many servers do we need to have to make the dining service work well in the culinary department? Who's running the front desk? Do we have 24 hours concierge, or do we have 12 hours, or do we have 15 hours? There's housekeepers, and their supervisors, and all of those components. So I would say labor is one of the biggest expenses that gets away from us the fastest. It's hard to kind of keep your pulse on it. There's a lot of different tools in place for operators to do that. And you can kind of always feel like you need one more person to help. Like, we're not getting the rooms cleaned enough. We're not serving the meal fast enough. We need more people. It's not always a more people problem. And sometimes if you aren't cautious about adding more people, you're draining that revenue component and devaluing the product overall. Food costs, like raw food, we spend a lot of time really looking at we have a very specific ordering guide for our culinary directors to follow, because the more we buy of the same product, we get some rebates from various vendors and such, and that's a big play in culinary. It also allows us to really manage their costs, because we know what chicken breasts they're buying. You'd be surprised how many different kind of bulk chicken breasts you can buy, and they can be $3 and they can be $10. And so you're really trying to find high quality at the lowest price. And all of our communities have a budgeted per resident day amount to be spent on food for the whole day. Not unlike, your meal plan at school, we have kind of what we're trying to spend, and we have a target. So all of the food that you might prepare for 100 people, that cost is divided by 100 people, divided by the number of days in the month, and that's giving you your per resident day raw food expense. And that's really how we're managing those costs. So it's that minutia, because food cost is one of those areas that there's also food waste. You can order stuff you never use, or it goes bad before you use it. So there's a lot to the culinary department that's beyond preparing great food, but it's really managing that business side of things and those costs associated with it. And then in the clinical side of things, obviously there's medical supplies, there's basic first aid supplies, there's the pill cups and those sorts of things. But the biggest thing by far in the wellness department is labor. In memory care, the industry standard is anywhere from one caregiver for every eight to 10 residents living with dementia. So if you have 24 residents in your memory care, you're running possibly three per shift, at least for waking hours, then that's going to be your first 2 shifts. And overnight, you might go down to 2. So you start looking at budgets that are kind of giving you a total number of needed full-time employees, and then you're building a schedule from that. And it's all variable on the number of people that you're providing care for in the assisted side and the memory care side. And we have various staffing patterns and ladders that we're following state. Some of those are state specific. Some of them are, what we find as best practices in absence of a state regulation. Same thing goes with kind of a licensed nurse. How many nurses you need, what they can do, what's their scope of practice. That's going to depend on the state, and that's going to drive up your labor costs. When you think about, I think about wages have been one of the greatest areas of increased costs for us in the past 4 years since COVID, really. And that's been one of the greatest challenges to overcome, is just we've had the component of labor's become more difficult to manage just because the wages have increased, but it's not like we can get super efficient on any other component because it is related to care. So you either have to drive up your revenue or you have to cut costs somewhere else. And those are a lot of the decisions when we start talking about value creation that you have to start looking at. All right, I'm going to keep going unless you guys have any questions. I feel like I'm just talking.
Kelly, can I interrupt you for just a second? Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah.
You mentioned it very quickly and sort of in passing, the costs incurred for, your building that got hit by a tornado. Talk a little bit about the residents. What did that mean for the residents?
Yeah, that's the hard part. So it happened on the 31st of March at 3 p.m. That's how I remember, like between 3 and 4. They stayed over. We had everyone. The sirens went off. They evacuate into the halls, so they have to shelter in place because in a tornado, that's what you do. So you actually bring all the residents into the interior, out of their apartments, so that they're not near windows. The sirens went off. They started to kind of say, "Okay, it's passed," and then all of a sudden it hit. And the team described it as like they were in a movie and all at one time, every single door in the building opened up and started slamming. And we had a corridor and you could see, it's a fire door. So it's metal kind of door frame for double doors. That is completely bent in when we walked it the next day. So like the building actually compressed and came out. And the residents, we immediately lost power. Our roof ripped off on part. It was an independent and an assisted. And then we had cottages. So it's a campus environment. So the independent living apartments, we lost the part of the roof. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. Like we are very, very fortunate. So everyone sheltered in place overnight. We got everyone down into the dining room. We got we pulled mattresses. It wasn't really safe to be up where the roof had been because there was just damage. We had windows blown out in some apartments. Chris and I left Nashville the next morning and we got up there, and every building has a safety plan. So you have a contract with a charter bus kind of transportation company. Unfortunately, unlike a hurricane that is coming, you start calling and making sure your bus is available, and you start calling your sister communities on where you could house residents if you have to evacuate, and you have time. I've never been through a tornado. It was like, boom, it hit, and we had to be in action. We had there was two other operators in Market in Little Rock that one, our executive director used to work for. We called their CEO and said, can you help us? We need to move residents. So we evacuated the entire campus. Some residents went home with families. Some, because of the independent living folks, they went home with their families very begrudgingly. I did a lot of talking to adult daughters and sons and telling them it was going to be okay and we'd figure this out. But most of them, to be honest, we displaced to other communities that weren't even ours. We had a community in Tupelo, Mississippi that was a new development. So we had a lot of vacant apartments. So we took the assisted living that we know we needed to have nursing care for, like some of our more serious residents. We were able to take about 10 or 15 there. And they lived there for, I want to say, probably 2 months. And then we brought them back up to Little Rock to be closer to family. So far, we've been able to move in about 15 to 18 residents, and the cottages have been repaired, but we haven't been able to move anyone back. So they're still displaced, but they're very loyal. We have gatherings for them once a month. We do different we're trying to stay connected. We want to welcome them back as soon as we get open, but it's complex. I mean, we're being held, they're saying we have to bring the building back up to code, right? So it's an older building, so it wasn't built under the 2020 code or whatever, the new laws. So there's a lot of back and forth between the insurance company and all of those people. But we were fortunate everyone stayed safe. Our team did an incredible job. We happened to have had kind of one of our support leaders was just in the area. She was getting ready to fly out. She stayed. She was there overnight. And yeah, they did an incredible job. And the residents and families have been incredibly gracious with us. And just from a business standpoint, we're still you have business loss insurance up to a point and then you don't. And we're just making kind of decisions day by day to kind of figure out how we're selling and trying to pre-sell to move people back in. But we have an open date tentatively of July for the assisted living, possibly October by the time we get the independent living. But that's a lot of construction. Things have to happen for that to happen. And that's been, very similar, from a hurricane standpoint, you do something similar depending on the damage. We had a hurricane evacuation out of our Victoria, Texas building right when we started Vitality, actually. And we were only displaced for about 3 weeks total. When it was all said and done, we were able to start moving residents back after 3 weeks, which was great. But others aren't, depending on the extent of the damage, you're not always as lucky.
Thanks for sharing that. That's a unique story we've not had in class ever that I'm aware of.
it taught me a lot. It keeps you humble, this business. It really does. All right. So when we think about building revenue and building your business when it comes to operations, as I said, census is king at the end of the day. It's probably your number one driver. And so there is a lot of focus on filling a building. And when we got filling a building from empty, meaning just open, just got built, whatever the case may be, you want investors are looking for. That's how your pro forma, your pro forma is like your projection of the first 5 years of operating the community, and it's really building out like how long it's going to take you to get stabilized. And long term, and what that really means is that your average occupancy rate and your kind of income producing profit a community should generate after being open for a certain period of time. So usually there's like the first, like we use 12 months to say it's ramp up time, and you are either kind of out of that considered new development and now you're just operating. And then also you want to get to about 90% stabilized. I would say pre-COVID days, before expenses were as heavy of a load as they used to be, you could get to 80 to 85 and be considered stabilized. But 90% really now is what's kind of considered stabilized. And it's just because you know that you have that steady income coming at that occupancy rate. And you can kind of count on it. You don't have as much fluctuation. And you've been open for 2 years, that's considered stabilized. And, most people say, well, gosh, you got to get to 95% occupied is the best thing. And actually, we got to get to 100%. In fact, we just had 2 buildings hit 100% occupancy. And it's really hard to have a conversation with those buildings and be like, you're not done. Like, where's your value? And that's what we just kind of went through a class with them on value creation, similar to this, because it may be an indication that you could charge more. You are highly desirable in your market. You have a lot of demand if you're 100% occupied. You are probably one of if people are touring 5 assisted livings in the market, you're probably falling in the top 3 if you're 100%. So that when we see a community start getting to 90, 95, I can guarantee you an owner's calling me and asking, am I going to start pushing rates and what rates am I going to start pushing? Because it's an indicator that you're on offense. That's kind of how I talk to my team about it. You're on offense. You're not on defense. You kind of get to dictate now what you can charge. Now you have to be careful. You don't want to overprice yourself and lose on the occupancy gain. But we start to look at that as you have more opportunity on that base rate that we talked about earlier. We don't play around as much with care rates. We tend to kind of keep those stable through the year. We want people to not see our services that are related to someone's health as something we play around with, that we kind of just know, hey, this covers the cost of these. We feel like it creates integrity around those services, but you will see fluctuation in the market on rate. When you talk about a community being 100% with no lost revenue, and what that means is that there's not a delay in the day, like the apartment isn't vacant for multiple days. When you have no lost revenue days, it means Kelly moves out on the 31st and Nancy's moving in on the 1st, and that apartment doesn't have a day it's not making revenue. So when you're at 100% and that's happening, then you definitely have opportunity to grow rate. You haven't hit your ceiling. What is pretty common in the industry is somebody gives their 30-day notice, which is very typical, like a rental agreement. On the 1st, they move out on the 30th or the 31st, and then we get a move in on the 15th. So for 2 weeks, that apartment was vacant, and you lost revenue on those days. And even more common is you'll see a lot of people move in, like we do. There's a lot of specials at the end of the month. So you'll see a bunch of people like take financial possession of an apartment on the 28th, but that vacancy started on the 1st, that was 28 days that you didn't make revenue on that apartment. Sometimes when I'm in a P&L review, we'll see, gosh, your occupancy went up, but your revenue dipped. And we can almost always look at, it was the number of days that vacancy. So if you're just looking at your occupancy numbers, you also have to be looking at when are you starting to collect the revenue on the actual apartment. And that's what's driving your overall revenue for that month. So you got it for 2 weeks versus 4 weeks in a month. Once a community hits that stabilized occupancy level, which is that 90% plus, filling vacant apartments becomes very accretive to the NOI. And so there's very small expense creep at 90%. Like, you're just kind of carrying the expense load at 90%. You're probably not adding 3 and 4 full-time employees because you moved 90 to 92%. You're probably not having to add a full-time nurse because you moved in 3 more people. When you're in those upper echelons of the occupancy percentage, your expense load's staying relatively stabilized. So you're playing a slightly different game than when you are in a new development. You have to pay for 8 department leaders that are salaried expenses for maybe 5-10 residents for your first month. So now all of a sudden, like, your revenue is, you really need to drive more and more revenue because you're just trying to cover those expenses. When you're at 90%, you're covering your expenses. You're now trying to drive up that revenue, that profitability, more and more on the revenue side, because you won't fluctuate as much. Your costs are kind of pretty set. You add 1 more resident to your dining room, it's not going to be a huge expense for you to manage that and absorb that. So the power of rate. In general, rate revenue is 2 to 3. What we start looking at from an operation, it's 3 to 5 these last 2 years. Feels like expenses have continued to creep up, just like it has for all of us as inflation has gone up. So your rates, your rates that you're charging your residents have to go up to offset inflation alone. So there's typically a play on an internal increase to all of your existing residents for an annual increase. But then your market rate, so what you're charging a new customer or new resident coming in, our approach is to go 5% or more, depending on where you are from an occupancy standpoint. If you're stabilized, you might be north of 5%. If you're just getting to stabilization or you project that you'll be there, you'll stay at 5. And then if it's a new development or maybe we haven't performed very well, we might be less aggressive on what we're playing, what we're going to charge someone who's coming in as a new resident on that market rate. But you have to stay ahead of your inflation year over year so that you're growing that net operating income and you're really building up your bottom line. So if you don't do any rate increases, which is what we did, a lot of operators in 2020, we didn't do any rate increases as a result of COVID. But then you kind of saw in 2021, people started, and then in 22 and 23, you saw increases up to 10% in some markets, and some operators did, very what I would consider historically, those are probably fairly high as an industry for us. They're typically 3 to 5%. They kind of match what inflation is. So you kind of saw 1 year where a lot of people took a break from it, and then you saw this big push to start making up for those inflation costs. So this is a really great example. If you take a 100 apartment building that's 90% occupied with an average rate of $4,000. So that's your, rate per occupied unit, your RPU. If you fill 5 units to get to 95%, that gives you an additional $20,000 in monthly revenue. So they kept the numbers easy here for us. If you increase the in-house rate, so just all your internal residents 5%, on top of that, you'll get an additional $18,000. So that's how that plays. You're looking at, when you're budgeting for the next year, you're looking how much census can I grow, but then how much internal rate will I increase? How will that enhance my revenue line? If you increase your in-house plus your street rate, so that's your market rate, to 5% and move in only 2 units, that gives you an additional $26,400 in revenue. So that's a 30 to 35% increase in revenue, more than these other 2 examples. And now you add in your level of care or your med management or some ancillary fees, right? And you're driving more to that revenue line. So we just did Vitality as an annual meeting in March, and we did this class for everybody, and we had a real community where we showed if they if they just pushed their rate and they worked for 2 more move-ins versus trying to get 5, how much more revenue they were driving for the month. And then we looked at what would that do for your NOI for the year. And for an operator, that NOI for the year, that's your bonus. That's the value of your building. That's kind of what you're being, evaluated on. And so it really does start to make an impact to think about rate being powerful and coupled with that census idea. So you do have to have a high volume of move-ins, but you have to be charging that right rate so that you are maximizing what you're doing. We talk a lot at Vitality about maximizing your revenue component. And that comes from really understanding where you are in your market. Are you stabilized? Are you not? And if you are, where's your ceiling? Go test it and see where you could push that revenue component. And the expense management side, equally powerful. Most businesses are valued at that NOI, that net operating income, and that's really your EBITDA. So you have to control the expenses as part of that value creation. Every dollar you save, right, it's driven back towards that NOI number. So labor is anywhere from 30 to 40% of our total expenses. So we do things like make sure everyone's clocking out for their lunch break. If you can send someone home a half hour early, send them home. Like all of those minutes and dollar and half hours count to big dollars when it comes to labor. Also in overtime where you're paying someone time and a half, those overtime hours really, really add up. And then if you are needing agency, which is less and less so, but we still have 2 communities in this Nashville market where employment is incredibly competitive, especially because there's so much hospitality in this market. Agency is usually double or triple what you would pay someone if you were hired them yourself. So you are outpacing your labor expense when you're dependent on agency to cover open shifts in your community. And then we talked about raw food. So we typically budget that, as I said, a per resident day expense. And that's usually your second largest kind of, you look at the buckets of total money spent in the P&L. Raw food's going to be one of your, like in the top 2 to 3. And the way we look at this is the day that you order your food, that month is going to take that hit. So if you order on the 31st for the next month, you're not going to get that expense in the first of the month. It's going to hit your P&L for the month that you were in, that you made that order, even though you're not consuming that food then. So there's all these little things that we do, honestly, in the business to try to, just like you do a household budget, it's the end of the month and you're waiting to get your next paycheck to go to the grocery store perhaps, or you're going to get the bare minimum of what you need, or you're going to go back to your pantry and see what you can make. We're doing very similar things and trying to be efficient and strategic with how we spend our dollars. And then we talked a lot about the building maintenance. And so we, anything over $1,000 is a capital expense for the most part. So we do capitalize some of those investments back into the physical plant. But sometimes, replacing carpet in an apartment for a new resident is $800. It's not $1,000. And you have the labor cost, and then you have to paint. So those things add up as well. And you really do have to make sure that you're strategic. Like our standard is you have a minimum of 2 apartments of every floor plan rent ready. So you're not doing 20 rent readies in one month unless you have a lot of turnover, but you kind of always have some of your inventory ready to go, and you're not having to spend big dollars to get ready for more move-ins because you don't want to slow down the move-in pipeline. So margins matter. I think I spend, in this last year, more time looking at margin than NOI and census, because it really is, as we have seen inflation really have an impact on the business, as we've seen labor costs go up. Margin is really the new measure of, are you driving enough revenue to get a good margin within the business? And it's easiestly defined as that percentage of each dollar earned that's left over after paying for all of your expenses. And 30% was the gold standard for many, many years in my world, and then north of 30% if it was independent living. So there's some breakdown here of what we look at now. So to do that really well these days, it really does require this focus of maximizing that revenue and being super efficient on expenses and strategic so that you are looking for margin growth. And as I talk to investors, we have investors, different investor partners that we work with, and there really is a lot of focus on that margin growth year over year as we project out the next 2 or 3. And as we built our 2024 budgets, we kind of plugged everything in and we went and looked at what's our margin by the end of the year. And then we'd go back to the drawing board and say, we got to push revenue or we got to cut expenses. And we'd go back. And if it wasn't an acceptable number, we were going back to the table to say, what's it going to take? And how could we get there? If we think we needed to drive rate up, then it's going back to look at the product, going back to look at what our position is in the market. How do we position ourselves to demand more of a rate? And then that kind of goes into your strategic planning for your sales plan, your operational plan, your customer service plan. This is really driving every component of the business as you try to get to your value creation to drive up that margin. Oh, the good old cap rate, that is very confusing, but I just tell you to follow the equation is how we do it. So it's an estimate of the percentage of the rate of return that a property community is going to produce on the investment. So the lower the cap rate, it's more desirable for an investor. And a multiple of 100 is divided by the capitalization rate. So really cap rate equals your NOI divided by the price of the community. So when you think of an investor, they're looking at the cap rate because they paid that price for the community. And that's how they're measuring if Vitality is a good partner, if we're good operators, are we creating value? So this cap rate becomes really important because that is how, if we're going to go sell one of our buildings or we're going to go buy a building, this is how we're evaluating what we think we should pay for it or what we think we could charge for it if we were going to sell the building. And that valuation is a process that's used to determine the income value of a community for, like I said, the buyers, the bankers, and the appraisers. And when you understand this as an operator, it's not like I walk around and have cap rate coming out of my head like an analyst does. I have to sit down and think through it, but I understand how owners are looking at the business. When I show up on an owner call, I'm very conscientious of value creation. And while I might be talking about investing in the culinary program, it is to increase our value proposition, which will demand more rate. Or if I'm asking them to build a memory care, it's because we've had X number of move-outs and lost revenue because we can't hold on to people who are living with dementia. So your business cases for things that you want to do to differentiate yourself or have fun, even an engagement program investment. We're working with a new group that's doing some really cool stuff in engagement where you type in the resident's life story and AI is kind of partnering them up like, hey, this resident needs to meet these people, and hey, this person's quality of life is decreasing. And it's awesome. And to get that investment, I've got to go and say, hey, this is the way for us to create more value for the customer, be differentiated with that. So for in any aspect of the business, then you're speaking the language of the people that keep putting the dollars into the business, and it allows you to kind of have more influence with what you're trying to do, at least in my experience. Questions? I went through a lot. I probably talked a lot.
I will tell you, you present some of this stuff so well. The financial management piece of it is always the hardest, it seems like, for the students to get, especially if you're coming into this course with no accounting background at all or finance background. It's just a lot of numbers suddenly, and you do a phenomenal job with this. So I'm always thrilled that you visit us, and then we can share your slide deck, and we'll also share the recording, and that helps as they work through. Questions or comments for Kelly?
I'll say don't be intimidated by the financial stuff. I was for a while, but once you even when I was doing memory care and I understood labor and I understand the expense side and I understood what the operators are trying to do, I was incredibly more effective, and a lot more doors opened up for me along the way. So, I think if you can embrace it and understand the impact that you might have if you're working in the industry, I always tell every position, every caregiver, every housekeeper, they make a difference in these components. I want everyone to understand how the business functions, because it's to all of our benefits. So don't let it intimidate you. If I can figure it out, anyone can.
I love that. I'll also do a little shameless plug to side note to the students. You probably noticed in Kelly's presentation, there were some graphics and a few charts, even some verbiage that you've seen before. That's because we put that together when we built the financial management model, and we ran it by Chris Gay, who's the CEO of Vitality, and he liked it. And he teaches his own employees and then does a lot of teaching on the national stage, developing future leaders. And he asked if he could, use those things. And it was like, yeah, absolutely. So it warms our heart that as hard as it is sometimes and kind of a pain and not so much fun, the module is really on track for what you need to know in the industry. So
we use it all the time.
Darcy and I are very proud of that.
You should be. We should be.
Well, anything else? We'll let you get on. I think I heard some thunder rolling in the background a few times coming.
There was. I was waiting to see if my phone would start beeping or if my kids would. I told them, just come get me if they put the alarm on and we got to go downstairs. But I think everything's good. We should be just fine.
Kelly, thank you so much, especially at this late hour for you. Hope you come through all this little storm safely. And I look forward to us chatting again at another time. So thank you very much.
Thanks, you guys. It's great to see you. Everyone, thank you.